my name's John. I'm very excited and pleased to be here, and I want to thank the organizers and Liberated Lens. They're a fantastic crew doing amazing work with training people in digital filmmaking and also doing programming like today's programming, and I encourage you to come out and support this crew and this group as often as you can. I love the programming that they do, and I know that they continue to produce amazing documentary work as well as other things. Whoops. Uh-oh, it's the national security state. So this film, I think, is a wonderful introduction to a history that is too little known. So my specialization in terms of research and scholarship in the past has been racism in American law, and I got involved in doing research and writing on Asian American legal history, and ended up finishing a dissertation focusing on the period of Chinese exclusion ending. So it was exciting to see the information about the development, exciting, sad, tragic, to see the information about the development of this racist exclusionary law and policy so clearly and well articulated in this film. And so I'm grateful to the organizers for presenting this. I encourage you to watch the full film on PBS, Tuesday the 29th. What time? 8 p.m. on KQED, right?
Thanks, John. Hi, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Nancy Wong. Gerald, wherever he is, asked me to talk to all of you about how the Chinese Exclusion Act actually impacted my family. And there's two things I wanted to kind of, I know that this film is like 2.5 hours long, and so we saw the shortened version of it, but there's two things that really strike me about that wasn't in this showing, and one of the two legacies that I wanted to share is that in 1907 they started a border patrol because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we have the Border Patrol these days, and it was birthed, or, because of patrolling the southern border for Chinese who were coming to the United States from Mexico, which my father did do. Okay, so I wanted to, luckily, he was not detained, and he was able to come through without being arrested. The other legacy is that because of all of the massacres and lynchings that occurred during the 1880s and late 1870s, that is the reason why we have Chinatowns in like Los Angeles, San Francisco, because the Chinese, after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, people just basically tried to settle where they were working. But because of all of the terrorism that fell upon Chinese, they were forced to flee the places where they were settling, like in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Cheyenne, where they were being lynched, and came to San Francisco and other cities and formed Chinatowns. So later on, after everybody has had a chance to speak, I'll talk more about my family history, but I wanted to just sort of highlight those two things that are like the legacy of exclusion.
Hi, everyone. I actually wanted to start off by asking you a question, and that is, could you raise your hand if you learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act in school? Did anybody? Okay, more than I thought. more than a sentence in your history book, maybe even? Okay, much better than I thought. I think when I first heard that this film was being made, I was excited, sad that this was happening, because I think many of us thought that this would be sort of our version of Eyes on the Prize, you know, that we would be able to go into what happened, but also that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans were actually part of the resistance in fighting back. When you do see the 2.5-hour version of the entire film, you'll hear more in depth about how the Chinese American Citizens Alliance pooled their money together to file lawsuit after lawsuit to challenge, under the equal protection, to challenge being able to be a citizen if you were born here in the United States. And I think that's really important. Wong Kim went all the way to the Supreme Court to challenge the fact that he was born in the United States and had the right to be a citizen. And just as we're also hearing about women like Tessie Williams, who at the age of 6 years old desegregated her New Orleans school. These are the things that I think needs to come out, and it's part of our American history. And I think it's important to know all the different parts of that history. I think it was mentioned too, the level of violence. A lot of people don't know that for over 50 years, Chinese were lynched, their properties were decimated and destroyed, and for all the Chinatowns that are here, it's part of it was that they weren't able to live anywhere else, but also it was part of protection as well, living in these neighborhoods. So I think I'm excited to hear what your questions are, and I think both Nancy and Sasha and I work very closely together today to fight the new forms of dehumanization that's being leveled at Muslims, that's being leveled at Latinos, what's happening at the border. Remember that the Chinese Exclusion Act was considered, it was considered a temporary ban that got renewed over and over again before it became permanent. And this is the same rhetoric that's being used today to say that to secure our country, we need to temporarily ban people from entire country, from entire faith. And so we need to see that. We need to be paying attention, and we need to fight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha from the Asian Law Caucus, similar to what Sin was saying. So I work in the National Security Civil Rights Program. We work specifically with Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian community members who are impacted by broad range of different racist policies, xenophobic policies, specifically like the Muslim ban, which we can see the direct parallels to the Chinese Exclusion Act. You see post 9/11, the way that Muslims have been characterized in the media, in the way that our government handles policies, directly parallels the way that Chinese folks were treated during the Chinese Exclusion Act time. You see with the ban specifically, right now we have 5 countries that are basically, people from those 5 countries are banned completely. You see oftentimes it's women. I think that's a similar parallel. You see women who are in their home country in Yemen, and they're married to American citizens here, and there's no way for them to come over here. There's no direct form of immigration that allows for folks under the current ban, even under like extreme health condition issues that folks are facing. So and then it's not even just those 5 countries. You see across the board Muslims from many different countries outside of those 5 who are being denied tourist visas, being denied immigrant visas to visit to come here. And again, like, yeah, direct parallels to the way the immigration system has historically treated folks that they consider unable to assimilate.
Can I ask the audience a question? How many of you have passports and have gotten visas? passports and gotten visas. Okay. So the passport and visa system originated in the provision of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which distinguished between laborers and merchants. So in order to enforce that distinction, they had to set up a process of, having people get passes and having them be verified and stamped. So if you study the evolution of the international regime of passports and visas and state control of travel by citizens, it also goes back to Chinese exclusion.
And another legacy is, how many of you have ever been to Angel Island, which is out there in San Francisco Bay? That was an immigration station, and 95% of the immigrants that came through there were Chinese, and they were interrogated. They were subject to imprisonment because they were Chinese. They were asked questions like, how many steps is it from your house to the well in your village? And then if it didn't match whoever sponsored you, you were returned back to to China. So, or you had to be detained there. So people should try to go there if you haven't been there before. It's a very interesting place. But again, mass incarceration of people just because of who they are. My father did 2 9-month terms at Angel Island just because he dared to go back to China and try to, marry my mother and make a family and then come back. So we have that. That's a legacy, Angel Island. And then, as it was said earlier, the Chinese Exclusion Act had to be renewed every 10 years. So there was political will to pass it every 10 years until 1943 because the Japanese were basically saying to the Chinese in Asia, how can you align yourself with the United States in this war? Look at the way that they're treating the Chinese in America. And that is the reason why it finally was repealed in 1943. Yes, so it was in effect for over 60 years. Oh, okay. I just want to see, let's see how are we going to do this. I just have a few slides from my personal family album because I was asked to talk about my family history. So my father was born in 1903. Okay, so when we were growing up, my younger brother and I were growing up, we used to go around, the little town that we lived in, and people would come up to my father and say, "Wow, you have really cute grandchildren." And he would just nod his head and say, "Yeah, thank you." Anyway, so he was born in 1903. He couldn't come to the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So he, my uncle, and my grandfather decided to try to immigrate from China to Mexico. At the time, in the early 20th century, there were no, people just kind of crossed over the border. There were in 1907, there were 75 Border Patrol agents that monitored a 1,900-mile southern border with Mexico. Now there's 15,000 Border Patrol agents, right? So, okay. Anyway, that's a picture of my mother. Okay, so another thing that happened is that many Chinese men went back to China to marry, but then they weren't able to bring their wives or their children to the United States. So people were separated, and in my case, with my family, my parents married in 1936 and weren't reunited until 1956. So they were separated for 20 years. Next. That's my father. My sister and I used to tease him that he, wore a suit in the snow up in Lake Tahoe. It's like Nixon, on the beaches of San Clemente, right? Anyway, next. So yeah, my family, just like all families now, are coming to this country for a better life, and I don't understand what the crime is in, crossing the border in search of a better life for your family. Next. So this is a map of where most of the older Chinese immigrants come from. This is like pre-1960. As you can see, there's this South China Sea, and then there's the Pearl River Delta. And so there's about 8 counties that surround that area where a lot of the older Chinese immigrants are from. Okay, next. Okay, this is my father came through Mexico, so they gave him a name of Manuel Wong. So I just thought that would be cute to show. He came on a ship from Mazatlan, and as you can see, the ticket is, or the receipt is dated October 14th, 1920. Okay, next. Wan Yet Wong, or Wong Wan Yi is the pronunciation. So this is my father's alien registration card. It was like a piece of paper with like your address on it. I guess he used to live in Madeira. My father was a farm worker, so that's why he wound up in Madeira. Okay, next. And then as you can see, there's a little bit of writing. I couldn't quite capture it, but it's kind of like in the middle. It says immigrant inspected. Anyway, so they stamped it like every time I guess he came through. Next. Okay, and then on the back, they, I guess, put his fingerprint and then he had to sign it. So that's like the, I guess, the 1920s version of the green card. Okay, next. And then this is like a document that, it's like his medical exam. So like nowadays, people who come to the United States have to be medically cleared. So they have to go through like a medical exam, and same thing with back in those days. That medical examination is dated 1935. Okay, and that's a picture of him. That's a picture in China. Okay, so I don't know how many of you ever heard about the Paper Sons issue? Okay, so in 1906, we had this big earthquake in San Francisco, and everything was there was a great San Francisco fire as a result of it. So all of the papers were, all of the vital statistics like birth certificates, marriage certificates, everything burned and was destroyed. So anytime a Chinese person would go back to China, they would get into these pictures, and that's my mother and my older sister, but the person to my mother's right is someone that our family later adopted. But people would actually go home and then take pictures with fellow villagers so that later on when they came back from China, they could say, oh, I had a son in China, and then register that son, and then that way that son could immigrate to the United States even though they weren't related. Okay, so that's how the paper son thing is another legacy of Chinese exclusion, so that people could, get their families here. Okay, that's my father in China with my older sister. Next. And then that's my mother with my older sister in China. So my first cousin Eddie, who's in the middle, he was a paper son because my father I don't think my father had citizenship at the time, and neither did my uncle, Eddie's father. My uncle, the way he was able to be here in the United States is that he joined he became a merchant marine or something like that, and then jumped ship in Seattle. So, and this is that they're working on some farm, I think it was in Central Valley or something like that. Okay, next. And also, so my mother and my father were separated for 20 years, so she wasn't able to come until after the Chinese Communist Revolution, and my father petitioned for her as a refugee. So, she was able to work as a farm worker also with my father. And this final picture is my father at Angel Island, because Angel Island was, I don't know if any of you know the history, but it was a state park, and one day one of the park rangers, it was actually slated to be destroyed, and one day one of the park rangers started, I guess, wiping the walls and discovered all of this calligraphy on the walls that had been carved into the walls by the people who were detained there. And then he finally got in touch with members of the Chinese community, and then in turn, the members of the Chinese community raised money to dedicate it, and they asked people who were detained at Angel Island to be at the dedication ceremony. So my father was there. It was the only time that I ever saw my father move to tears, when he saw the calligraphy on the walls. Okay, thank you very much. That's.
Yeah. Okay. The role of William Randolph Hearst is not mentioned. His papers whipped up the yellow peril and the racism, and certainly he should be held very responsible for poisoning the atmosphere. Another thing I'm reacting to in the film is I think we all need to know about each other's oppression. So we need to know the history of Black oppression, Japanese oppression, Jewish oppression. A lot of people, because of anti-Zionism, forget about the suffering of the Jews for centuries at the hands of Christianity. When we speak about Islam, we ought to say that people lived in Islam who were strangers, like Jews living in Islam, did much, much better than in Christian Europe. So also Filipinos, like the book by Carlos Buosan, America in the Heart. I think that's what I got out of film, how we each need to know. Like when I saw the family stuff, it made me think of family stuff that I saw. So I think it's splendid, and thank you very much. But we need to know about each other.
Actually, he mentioned something very important about William Randolph Hearst, and because he actually, late 19th century is when capitalism in the stage of capitalism developed, and China had these European enclaves to help to exploit China at the behest of the European powers. And that same William Randolph Hearst and the military theoretician Alfred Mayhem, they were championing to build a navy to conquer the Pacific and also, wage war against Spain for the dominion of the remaining Spanish colonies in the Atlantic. So when we're talking about, the movie shows a lot about labor, so it was cheap labor. Chinese were used as cheap labor, in the United States. And that's the consequences of, the railroad to expand to the West as a Yankee capitalism developing to exploit, other peoples that were right here in the West, definitely. So I just want to end in the last sentence that during that last decade of the Chinese Exclusion Act, almost immediately also the U.S. waged the Operation Wetback 1 and later 2, expelling more than 500,000 Mexicans out of this country. So the U.S. has always been an anti-immigrant, anti-dark-skinned people right from its formation as a republic.
I have a question. One of the speakers at the end talked about the Exclusion Act as a flaw and a mistake. And I wanted to know what people on the panel think about this, because I think it wasn't a mistake. It was part of the whole foundations of this country: slavery, genocide, the incarceration of the Japanese, which was later. But I just wanted to know what people thought about that.
There's always going to be people that apologize or rationalize, for the policies and practices of this country. Like when my husband and I went to Angel Island, one year I decided to take my daughter there so that on Father's Day, so that she could learn about her grandfather's history. And the docent was basically, describing the barracks as kind of a place where everybody, had a sense of community, and that the women, sewed and did all these crafts, and the children were happy playing and things like that. So I had to raise my hand and remind her that, a lot of people committed suicide as a result of being detained there, and she was really taken aback. So, there are always going to be people, and we have to just stand up and speak up anytime we hear some type of rationalization or apology for what they do.
Yeah, I'd like to just also remark that, whenever I hear someone say this is un-American, never again, it's like I'm so tired of like never again, because it's like to the points that that were made earlier, we could draw a timeline of the atrocities that have been committed against people of color, Native Americans, African Americans. We could draw a timeline, and they would be corresponding to U.S. national interests and globally what was happening, right? So I think exploitation, the film, the 2.5-hour film does go into more examples of how this form of exclusion could go on for over 60 years. But in this one excerpt, I mean, it showed how it happened, right? It was sort of like today, things don't happen in isolation. You build up rhetoric, you pit groups against each other. In this case, blacks were pitted against Chinese, and there continue to be those forms of alliances. And I think there are also other challenges too about not knowing our history within our own community. So one of the things that we have worked really closely with is to work on anti-Black racism within the Asian community, the anti-Muslim fervor that's growing in reaction to, I think, some of the narratives that are prevailing today. Even the stuff that we know more about because of technology, these things were happening. They just were not, we weren't just able to prove it. It wasn't able to go viral like it is today. So I think it is part of our DNA, but I think the promise of America, I mean, there's this quote about, if America hasn't broken your heart, you haven't loved her enough. It's true. It's the promise that no progress, no advancement has ever occurred without people coming together to say it's wrong. And so that is in our DNA, and that's something that I think we have the capacity to do, just as we have the capacity to commit shameful acts.
I don't think Chinese exclusion was a mistake. I don't think European settlement and conquest and Indian massacres and the Trail of Tears were a mistake. I don't think slavery was a mistake, and I don't think segregation was a mistake. These were all functional from the perspective of the development of the United States as a nation and as an economic superpower in the present. There is also a long and too little known history of struggle against all of that, all the way going back to the first Europeans who stepped on this continent, North and South America. So I think it's powerful to understand the way that the bad stuff happens, which this excerpt does really well. I'm looking forward to seeing the longer version that includes the resistance.
A couple of things. One, I saw some names that came up in the film: Tilden, Bret Hart, Page, and Kearney. And if you lived in the Bay Area, you're familiar with all of these. And this film gave one the impression that all of these people had problematic history, yet their names appear on streets, in schools, and seeing that the LeConte school was recently renamed. I wonder if there's any possibility that some of these other names could be, relegated to the family album and not be on the streets or the buildings or the. Anyway, so that was one thought. Another is I really appreciate the film. I enjoyed watching it. I learned some things. I relearned some things that I'd forgotten. It always bothers me a little that we address all of these things in a piecemeal fashion, that we feel bad in a piecemeal fashion, we fight in a piecemeal fashion, and, anyway, but I really appreciate it when I see stuff that can be applied in a much more broad way, and just sort of dealing with the immigration as an idea of like, why do we have it at all anymore? I mean, are we doing this for the sake of indigenous peoples? If not, then what are we doing it for? So I'd like to see a lot more of that, instead of just sort of like, well, let's recognize this group and that group and then the other group, and then let's go back home and But yeah, I know it's hard. I know the one way or another, anyway, it's got to get done.
Well, it's actually interesting that you raised this issue about the names in the film. I'm actually part of an effort in San Francisco where a playground is named after Julius Kahn. Does anybody know who Julius Kahn is? Okay. So really, this crowd knows its history. So Julius Kahn was a congressman in California, and he was instrumental in getting the Exclusion Act to make it permanent. And so there's an effort currently now to remove his name from the playground, which is actually enjoyed by immigrant families that he actually tried to exclude. And we haven't received any resistance, but I think there has been some question about, well, nobody knew who he was. Why does anybody care? He was a prominent Jewish American leader, is actually an immigrant, who really went after Chinese. He also hated Japanese and Korean and South Asians and Filipinos. He was against Asian immigrants and not others. And so we ended up working with the Jewish American community to build solidarity around this and to really say that it does matter, not just for historical facts, but I think it's a teaching moment. It's a teaching moment that I had an opportunity to talk to my child about. I don't want to have somebody like Julius Kahn on the name of a playground. This person deserves to be studied vigorously in history books and museums, but not put on a pedestal. A lot of people think that Kearny Street in San Francisco is named after Dennis Kearny. It's not. It's a different Kearny. But there's other efforts happening, like Phelan Avenue and other efforts. But I think those things do matter. It's important.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, this thing of like a lot of the leaders of the Exclusion Act were immigrants themselves. They just happened to be white-skinned, so they felt that they they had some greater right, even though they were immigrants themselves. But then I think it gets repeated nowadays. A lot of opposition to, DACA and all these things is coming from people who were immigrants or have immigrant experience themselves. So there's this ongoing thing of immigrants wanting the state to, enforce the rules and all this bullshit about, standing in line as if there's a line to, all that stuff. So I just wanted to talk about that sort of contradiction of immigrants or descendant immigrants taking these very anti-immigrant stances.
The only thing I can say about that is if you are a family member from either the Philippines or Mexico, and you are asked to wait in line to immigrate here, that is a 25 to 30-year wait if you were to do that. So I guess one of the speakers in the movie said that, it was a law, but it was wrong. There are lots of laws that we have nowadays that are also wrong. And I hope that people will join those of us who are working with organizations that serve immigrant communities to, help out with whatever you can. We are involved in a lot of different issues. Check out our websites. We have, I work for an organization called Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, and we provide legal assistance to low-income people in immigration and other areas where people can't afford to get lawyers, like, in housing or victims of domestic violence and so on. So like the commercial says, now that you've learned all about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the history, what will you do with that knowledge?
Sorry. This speaks to me pretty deeply, actually. My parents immigrated after the 1965 Immigration Act. You know, it's a certain educated community that was allowed to come here, both from like South Asia and East Asia. And those folks, especially in California, you know, are like in the Silicon Valley, and folks don't have a really comprehensive understanding of the history of racist immigration policies that have happened in the US. So you see like Taiwanese Americans who don't understand Chinese exclusion. They don't understand like the difference in the way that other Asian folks have historically been oppressed in the US. And so what happens is, especially these folks who come from more wealth, have more access to resources, have a larger voice in mainstream media, and it kind of perpetuates this idea of the model minority, you know. And a lot of our communities start to believe that somehow we like made it, we like pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, but again, not understanding the immigration policies that allowed us to come here and allowed us to succeed, that were related to housing as well, housing policies for certain Asian American folks. We weren't segregated in the same way that folks were during the Chinese Exclusion Act period. So for myself, as someone who works at Asian Law Caucus, works specifically with lower income working class immigrant communities, and who's from often like those communities who feel entitled and don't really understand the experiences of folks who are undocumented, who are struggling, who are coming from war-torn regions in different countries and are coming here and are directly put into like prison pipeline. I think a lot of it's like education. It's a very difficult process. We try to work very slowly with our communities to give people like a larger understanding and context, but it is definitely a challenge.
You know, I'll just say, I can't pretend that I know, you know, when South Asians come out and say they'll pay for the border, or Asians who came here through family-based immigration who are now for restricting immigration. I can't pretend to know, you know, where that perspective is coming from, but I think that there's an effort now to really talk about it more compassionately, to humanize these issues, because I think statistics and, you know, and the lack thereof of truths and facts has really created this confusing narrative of making people fearful, making people feel like there's not enough resources, or their lives are in danger, or their way of life is being threatened. And I think that what we have to do to counter that is to really put a human face on this. I mean, listening to Nancy's family story it's like so many millions of other families who really just came here to create a better life. And it's part of a universal experience, migration, moving, leaving your homeland, your community, your country, risking everything to do those things. It's a universal story, and I think those are, our challenge, I think, is to not try to counter that with brochures and a fact sheet, but I think to really create opportunities for people to hear these stories. We should be all outraged that children are being ripped from the arms of their parents at the border. You know, there should just be, we should be, you know, screaming out in the streets that this is happening. And unfortunately, this has been a part of American history, and I think the only way we're going to be able to stop it is by standing together.
Yeah, I have a I wouldn't say two-sided, a two-angled reaction to this thing. On the one hand, I definitely want to defend the right of anybody, especially poor people, especially non-white people, to come into this part of European settler North America or any of the other European settler colonies without any restrictions. At the same time, my emphasis is more on stopping what I call the United Snakes from plundering the world and making it so there is such a material benefits of being in this country. I think we need to fight to create a situation where that differential does not exist, where people may travel between different countries, but not because they need to improve their lives by coming to this one.
Does anyone else have any questions? You're next.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is I'm wondering the question about what's legal immigration, what's illegal immigration. I'm wondering what Native Americans would think about what's illegal immigration. And seeing if they want to do something about that. Along those lines, there's some Native Americans that are fighting to preserve a shell mound in Berkeley, and there's going to be an event tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. on 1900 4th Street, the Spenger's parking lot. So everybody's encouraged to be there. My question has to do with the rights that were either taken away or just otherwise not available when the Exclusion Act was passed and when those rights were returned. I'm assuming that since Chinese were not considered citizens, they couldn't vote, for example, and I guess they couldn't vote until the Exclusion Act was overturned. About owning property, I guess that except for maybe in Chinatowns, they couldn't own property. In fact, my father told me that when he was looking for a place to move to, in the 1950s, that there were parts of Oakland that they said, no, you can't move there because Chinese aren't allowed to move there. I'm wondering when that was overturned, if that was legal or they just the real estate was just realtors were just doing that. On the other hand, I think that certain kinds of schools were set up for the Chinese, like in San Francisco. So even though the Exclusion Act existed, I guess they felt they still had to provide some kind of schools, and I'm just wondering when the kind of segregated schools when that changed. So if any kind of those rights, the transformation of when some of that happened.
So there are three things that I heard. One is the question of rights denied because of Chinese exclusion. The second is the question of property ownership, and the third is segregated schools, right? Okay, so there was a federal court decision in 1878 which said, under the 1790 naturalization law, that Chinese were not white, because the original 1719 naturalization law said free white men could be naturalized. During Reconstruction, that was amended by the Republican Party to include aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. So Chinese immigrants were denied rights systematically. And that formulation of aliens, of non-black, non-white aliens not having rights, there's a lineage that goes through into the 20th century. It was codified into the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was one federal district court that said Chinese are not black or white. It was codified into the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, so it became national law. So the basis of denial of rights on the one hand was denial of citizenship to immigrants and denial of rights because you're racialized and considered inferior in general. On the question of purchasing housing, so there's a 1948 US Supreme Court decision called Shelley versus Kramer, I think, that ruled the enforcement of what were called racially restrictive covenants unenforceable under the federal Constitution. Before that law and continuing thereafter, there were a lot of places around the country that had laws that said, you know, no Chinese, no blacks, no whoever can buy this property because there's this provision of the contract that binds every subsequent perpetrator of this property to not sell this property to people. So there are like long fights about fair housing and the eradication of the whole racially restrictive covenant thing. Those, of course, existed in Oakland like they existed everywhere else in the country. Segregated education. In California, there's a California Supreme Court case called Tape versus Hurley, and there's some books about specifically the segregation of Chinese and the history of education that are worth looking at.
Also, I believe this was in California only. I'm not sure if it was federal or nationwide, but they had passed a alien land law which forbid any non-citizen from buying land. And the Chinese were very instrumental in developing California agriculture. And, you know, once they had developed it, they were not then permitted to buy any land. So that predated the buying of housing and segregation and all that. Now, I want to bring it up to date about schooling because there's a case, another Supreme Court case called, I think it's Plyler v. Doe, or something like that. It came out of Texas. The state of Texas sued and did not want to provide undocumented children with a free public education. So they sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually said, no, you know, undocumented people are entitled to certain unalienable rights, such as an education. So that is the law currently on the books, which I believe is also the fundamental basis for why the DACA program for Dreamers should continue.
I think you should tell Betsy DeVos that. I don't think she knows.
Oh, thank you very much, brother. Oh, boy. As we say, living down, there's a lot of us been pushed around. Red, yellow, black, white, and brown, with a tear of their own. I got a couple of questions I hope I don't swamp you with, but I want to, since we're together here, let's think and use this time to know we're having this panel educate us. What do we do? Just go home and say, wow, that was a nice one? Or do we spread this knowledge to others, particularly to our young people? You know, Elazar raised the question of hearse, but immediately in my mind, when he talked about how hearse and the yellow, actually the exclusion of Chinese was so fervent among white people that so-called white socialists went around talking about, we got to keep these folks out. A book that I love and I think everyone should read, it's called Iron Heel by Jack London. But you go and look at Jack London's writings on the Asian, he talked about the yellow peril. I said, wow, this is serious. This is why when I go around and I talk to these so-called socialist clubs and groups, I tell them, you can't have, white socialism is fascism. That's what it is. When you got a white clique talking about you gonna organize the working class and ain't got no people of color in your group, that's a petri dish for the alt-right. That ain't no damn social. A socialist organization, by its definition of what it means, has to bring together all of the oppressed. Red, yellow, black, white, and brown under one banner, or it's a failure before it even gets started. And I'm serious about that, and that's something you see here. Also, just wanted to point out, they hinted at it several times in the film. They said, look, you know what? They passed this act in 1882, and there was much to come in the parallel. Well, here's a parallel that we should all be familiar with. I think it was 1898, Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the Supreme Court decision that decided that separate but equal was equal. I'm talking about between black and white in the South. And we know what the results of that was. This stuff is very serious. We can't let it go. We have to share the knowledge, and we have to correct those organizations that think that they're going to change this world as a white clique. Can't happen. We have to work on that. And it's serious, and it's now. All right, the two questions I had, though. Oh, so please pay attention to legal changes that's going on. You know, some of us are so revolutionary, we don't have to pay attention to the laws. Watch out with that. That's not a good idea, because right now there's a law that's in our favor that is in front of the California Senate. It's called SB 1421. Find out more about it. Also, in elections, yeah, we're too revolutionary to run for elections. But I tell you what, if you don't run for elections, guess who does? That's right. Guess who does? Those same people that put that Exclusion Act forward, unchallenged, okay? So let's pay attention to what's going on around us. Lastly, so the question is, there was organized violence against the Chinese. I'm not trying to traumatize anybody here, but we need to know. Because I understand that there was like a mob kind of got organized. I'm not sure whether it was Oregon or Washington, where they literally forced all of the Chinese people in a whole city to leave that city. Could our panel please explain those instances? I bet you there was more than one. And then also, where you have that kind of fierce oppression, there's going to be some form of resistance. Now, I'm a youngster, so I didn't come up till the 60s. Yeah, usually I'm old as water, huh? But I remember there was a group out of Chinatown. I'm embarrassed, I can't pronounce, Iwa Kwan? All right, maybe I'm saying it wrong, but if you can remember, can we hear a little bit about the organizations that sprung up to resist this racist, white supremacist terror? Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know if I can address the organized violence question. We do know that there were massacres of Chinese people all over the West. Specifically documented was Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Cheyenne, where 28 Chinese were lynched and nothing was done about it. As far as other incidents, you know, there were, but I can't really, I can't recall what the other ones were. I think there was something that happened in LA too. And then as far as the resistance movement, actually, there were Chinese who resisted even before the baby boomers, you know, went to UC Berkeley and San Francisco State and started to organize, you know, Irwar Kun and Asian American Political Action, and some of the more left-leaning, you know, left-leaning organizations. So, for example, I think the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, for its day, it was progressive when it was formed. It may not be that progressive today, or was not progressive back in the 60s, but when it was formed, it was pretty remarkable, because here was a group of Chinese Americans basically saying that, you know, we're here to stay, and we're here, and we're going to integrate into American society. Other than that, I'll hand it over to John. I think he's the scholar here.
There's an amazing collection in Chinese American history at UC Berkeley's Asian American Studies Library, including primary documents in both Chinese and English, that you can do a bunch of research on this. One of the things so Chinese American Citizens Alliance is, as it suggests, Chinese American citizens. So it was folks who were born here who were taking the position that as citizens they should not be discriminated against. And I think they started in 1895. So they go back a long way. Before that, there were mutual aid associations in Chinese American communities based on locality, where in Guangdong province people came from, and they formed kind of an umbrella community organization, which later came to be known as the Consolidated Benevolent Association. That association in the 19th century, along with the Chinese consuls all over the West, would go around and document these massacres. So there are archives of hundreds, possibly thousands of killings of groups of Chinese or Chinese individuals in the West around the sort of exclusionary policy. I can't read them, I don't read Chinese, unfortunately, but I do know that they exist. The other thing that this CCBA precursor did was it mounted a massive litigation campaign against every aspect of discriminatory law that got enacted. And there are a couple of 1,300-page dissertations and papers that just sort of go through the court records and say, this case and this case and that case and the other case about this issue and that issue and the other issue. So these are Chinese immigrants, first generation, working class for the most part. I mean, they're not, some people made money, but there are mutual aid associations fundamentally of Chinese immigrant workers taking on the power of the entire state of California and also the federal government through the courts. And for example, in San Francisco, McAllister Street, Hall McAllister, famous American lawyer, leading light of the California bar from the 1850s. He was retained by these associations to litigate these cases. And there was considerable success. Not that I recommend an approach that involves litigation ever, but sometimes you can use the courts defensively.
You had also mentioned to keep up to date with the things policies, things that are happening. So to remind folks who maybe don't know or have forgotten, so the Muslim ban currently is being decided by the Supreme Court, and we're waiting on a decision over the next maybe month or so. We're not really sure. The oral arguments happened about a month ago, so keep your eye out for that, because that we're worried that it's going to have a negative result. And we want to be able to support our communities when that happens and fight against them in any way that we possibly can. That means telling your representatives that you stand with Muslim folks, you will not accept any exclusionary policies. It means making sure that you're creating space for your Muslim community members who maybe are impacted, and really working in whatever and showing up to protests and stuff. If those things are happening, show up and be a voice with the rest of your community.
So it is getting a little bit late here. I think we'll have about 2 more questions. Sorry, I think I might have interrupted there, but yeah, I see 2 more people on the stack, and then.
I just wanted to give Gerald and all of the audience, if you Google him, H-I-M, Mark, M-A-R-K, Lai, L-A-I, he wrote probably the definitive book on Chinese American history. He's kind of like the godfather of Chinese American history. So I'm sure that in his his book, it is very well documented what types of violence visited upon Chinese Americans and Chinese, and also the resistance movement as well. Just a little story about my dad. He was a farm worker, and he had probably like 6 years of formal education. But he was like the secretary treasurer of like one of the mutual aid associations that Jonathan is talking about. They were called tongs. I mean, some people have, I mean, the media has kind of whipped up this hysteria about tongs being, you know, dens of like organized crime and, you know, prostitution and drug dealing and all that. Actually, tongs are mutual aid societies designed to help fellow immigrants resettle here in the United States long before we had social services and things like that here, you know, after Johnson's War on Poverty. So my father was like the secretary treasurer, and there were all these different associations that from his area or his county, and it just so happened that Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the you know, first president of like, you know, New China, was from the same county as my father. So you know, Dr. Sun Yat-sen actually toured like all of the places where my father's mutual aid society had chapters, because he was raising money for the 1911 Chinese Revolution here in the United States. And he went to towns like Locke, Ileton, Walnut Grove, I mean, all the agricultural towns, and raised money from, you know, the farm workers that were there, and brought it back to China, and we all know what happened.
You know, earlier I think people were talking about immigrants being opposed to other immigrants, and like that's perplexing. I need people to really understand that none of us get out of this unscathed. This country, and Malcolm said it best for me because it's simple. He said that these people are so good at what they do, they can make you hate your friends and love your enemies. So when you hear about one group seeming to line up with the Trumpsters kind of people of the world, we are all taught in this country from beginning to the end of our lives. We are taught the values of this country. And so it is not bad people. It's the same people who can look at a film and watch a person literally beat damn near to death or shot and killed and walk into a jury room, and for reasons of training not be able to accept a human being was wronged or killed or whatever. And it's not them and us. We're all in this educational process. And the struggle is to not be as educated to the ways of hating your friends, but to be more educated to the ways of struggling with your fellow travelers to try to bring an end to that educational process.
So my training is partly in ethnic studies, and I don't know who it was who once said this, and if anyone knows, please tell me. Ignorance isn't innocent, it's organized.
Hello.
Thank you guys so much for your work, your presentations. I really, really appreciated it and got a lot out of it. I have two things. One is a comment and another is a question. Sort of just reflecting on a number of the themes that have come up in our discussion, whether it's the thing about, well, I stood in line and I went through the process and everyone else should do the same, or I think we could, even though the United States is a colonial settler society, the mentality that unfortunately some of the white workers were, imbued with at that time and really even up till today, the sense of entitlement over others, to me, it really reflects the framework of the system that we live in. So what do I mean? If we come to this event and there's more people than there are chairs, and inevitably some people are going to sit down and other people are going to have to stand, the solution is not to say, well, who's more entitled to have a seat? The solution is go finding some extra chairs so we can actually meet all of our needs. We live in a world, and I'm not just talking about this country, we live in a world where there's an abundance of resource, an abundance of wealth, where we can, really meet all of our needs. And the moment that we start to take that seriously, then we can start to meet, the needs of the entire population, of humanity in general. That's my main comment. Second question, it was a bit unclear in the film, the relationship of contract labor and how that was used to, I don't know if it was like a dog whistle or just an indirect way of excluding Chinese people. So if you guys could please elaborate on that, I would appreciate that.
Can you rephrase the question? I'm not sure I understand what you...
My question is, how is the usage of contract labor or the regulation of it used as a way to exclude Chinese people? That connection wasn't totally clear to me.
So in the film, they mentioned the 1875 Page Act, which excluded contract laborers and prostitutes. And what was the context for the discussion of contract labor?
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question, I do feel like it's hard to decouple the fact that there was an emphasis on Chinese workers and the fact that there was, at the same time, a broader context of dehumanizing Chinese. I think the tactic of focusing on labor it was a tactical move to try to get more support from people who'd never met Chinese or didn't think Chinese was a problem. So I think those were, I do believe it's inextricably tied, because the rhetoric that was used to say that they were criminal, unassimilable, debased, those allowed for, I think, the ability for them to, again, focus, quote unquote, narrowly on prostitutes and laborers to be able to form those alliances. And you could see, like, there were lots of bad actors. Labor was involved, immigrants who were recent immigrants who were here, and then of course it's funny today to think of California as the sort of resistance central when you think about the big role that California played in the anti-Asian movement. So I think it's all of those things.
So in the 19th century, there was an anti-slavery movement that was international. After the Civil War and Reconstruction and the so-called redemption, there was a shift in the sort of reformists who'd been doing the anti-slavery work to the question of bonded labor. So this is a question about free labor theoretically the US and the Atlantic world had moved past enslaved labor, but there was the question of the reproduction of essentially slave-like conditions for workers who were under contract. That set of workers was often racialized as Chinese. There are Chinese American historians who've been looking at specifically the kinds of contracts that Chinese laborers did come under, and sort of arguing that the way that Chinese contract labor was talked about was actually incorrect, but it was sort of a racist discourse. So the use of contract labor in the Page Law was, as you suggest, a racist dog whistle, because it allowed the legislators to get at Chinese workers and articulate their anti-Chinese animus in law without using the word Chinese. So the shift from 1875 to 1882 was naming Chinese as the category to be excluded versus contract labor or prostitutes. That's my reading.
Okay, well, I would like to thank our panel so much for sharing their time and knowledge with us all, and I'd like to give a round of applause to our panel.